Hello, and welcome back to the Living Faith by the Letter podcast, a weekly video series intended to spark your interest for studying the Bible and, more importantly, encouraging us to find ways to incorporate our faith into our daily life and live out the scriptures. We consider one letter of the alphabet. Today, we're going to be looking at the letter S. The letter S today stands for Sabbath. Sabbath is from the Hebrew word Sabbat or Shabbat, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Um, and this word has actually made it into English in a form. English is a rather mutt language. We kind of pick and choose from lots of different kinds of languages. But if you've ever heard of an artist or a teacher or a doctor, perhaps taking a sabbatical, what is a sabbatical? Well, it's a break. It means a break away from their usual work, their usual activity, in order, usually in the form of a getaway, a vacation, perhaps a way to rest and maybe to refocus on the work that they are engaged in. It can be a very useful thing. So a sabbatical and that period of rest is the same. It meant the same for God's people. It was a command that we see first given in Exodus chapter 20 in the section that we refer to as the Ten Commandments. See, it was one of the commandments that was given to Israel at Mount Sinai by God through Moses. And in Exodus chapter 20, in verse 8, what we would refer to as the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments is the Sabbath command. And in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, Moses says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." This is actually God speaking, but Moses is relaying it to them. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So this was a command for Israel, that on the seventh day, which to them in their calendar was Saturday, they would rest. They would not do any work. They would devote themselves to serving God, to pleasing God, to worshiping Him, resting and reflecting. And this was a very important principle, a great blessing to them because they had just come out of Egypt where they were slaves. Well, slaves don't get the weekend off, so to have a day dedicated to rest would have been a tremendous blessing. We see this principle again. This is in Exodus 20 with the law of Moses being instituted on Mount Sinai. But we see the first principle, as Moses mentioned in this passage, back in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2, using the model of God at the creation. He created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. It wasn't that God was tired and needed a break or a nap. It simply means that he ceased. That's what the word really means, to cease. He ceased his activity, which he was engaged in, which was creation. He stopped creating because he had created everything. We also see this principle again in before Exodus 20, in Exodus chapter 16, when Israel is wandering in the wilderness. They haven't come to the promised land yet, or they haven't come to Mount Sinai yet either. And they are running out of food, and God tells them he's going to provide them with food. He's going to provide them manna, which is the bread from heaven. They find it on the ground every morning. And in Exodus chapter 16 and verse 23, God tells them, "Go out and collect this in the morning every day for 6 days. But on the seventh day, don't go out to collect it because it's not going to be there. He's not going to send it on the seventh day. Instead, he will send twice as much on the sixth day. They are to gather that. And then on the seventh day, they are to rest." So that's God sort of preheating the oven, if you will, about this principle of this command that he's going to give them. Interestingly, of the Ten Commandments that we see listed in Exodus chapter 20, 9 of those are restated in the New Testament. This is in Exodus, it's the Old Testament, the law of Moses, the Old Covenant that God made with Israel. The New Testament, the New Covenant under Christ that God made with all of those who are called by his name. And 9 of those commandments are either restated in detail or in principle, at the very least, in the New Testament. And the one that is missing of the 10 is the Sabbath command. We are not to follow the Sabbath command. That's not something for Christians to do. Some would claim through church history that the Catholic Church in one of their ecumenical councils had redesignated the Sabbath for Christians as Sunday. They'd say, well, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. And that's not correct. They're two distinctly different things. There's some commonalities, but they're distinctly different. The Hebrew writer of the Hebrew to the epistles in the New Testament tells us that they are just different, even though they are connected. And when he talks about the Sabbath rest, he is referring to the rest that Israel would find in the promised land of Canaan, not the Saturday rest as we would see it, but he talks about the rest of Canaan. The rest for the Israelite people was the land of Canaan, and this again would have been a great blessing because they were nomadic. From Abraham onward, they lived in tents. Then later they were slaves. They didn't have a place to call their own. So God said, I'm going to give you this promised land where you can be in one place, you can be settled in, you can be at peace, you can be at home, and you can finally rest from your traveling. And it would have been a great blessing. And the Hebrew writer actually recalled how that first generation that came out of Egypt did not enter the rest of the Lord, did not enter the land of Canaan because of their disobedience or their unbelief. That's in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 18 and 19. They did not enter because of unbelief, because they were disobedient. The spies came back and said, the people are too strong. We can't go in there, and we're not going to go into the land that God has promised to give to us. Maybe we'll talk about that in another episode. The Hebrew writer then urges Christians under the new covenant to enter a future state of rest. He says, don't be like that other generation and fail to enter into the rest that God has provided for you. The rest that he is referring to is what we would think of as the rest of heaven. The idea that our physical human life is sort of our time of labor, our time of work, and when that time is over, we go to rest, that eternal rest of heaven. In Hebrews chapter 4, beginning in verse 9, the Hebrew writer says, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The people of God he's referring to would be the church, Christians. And he says there remains a rest. So that means we haven't entered it yet. Well, we've got Sunday. We've got Saturday too, actually. And that's not the rest he's talking about. There's something forward, something beyond that. And again, it's the rest of heaven. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. There's the call back to Genesis 2 again. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. That is, not be like Israel, who rejected God's gift and the promised rest and refused to go in. Don't be like that. So he says, let us be diligent. So even the Hebrew writer himself, as a Christian, is saying we collectively have not entered that rest yet, but we need to try to make sure that we do. So he's talking there about the rest of heaven. That is the Sabbath rest for the people of God, for Christians. Now, there are similarities between Israel's activity on the Sabbath under the Old Testament, where they would do things like rest, they would worship God, they would focus on God, and the Christians' activity on Sunday, which we refer to as the Lord's Day. But they are two distinctly different things. But we can and we should focus on God on the Lord's Day, and we should try to rest and rejuvenate ourselves for the coming week. That would be a good idea, but we cannot force or bind that upon others. Either what we do on that day or what we do not do on that day. It is something that each individual has to decide. Paul refers to this in his Roman letter, Romans chapter 14, as the church in Rome is having some discussions about what they should do, what kind of practices they should have, what's required, what's not required, and there's a lot of disagreement. And Paul says in Romans chapter 14 and verse 5, one person regards one day above another. Another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who does not eat for the Lord, he does not eat, and he gives thanks to God. So again, he's saying, do it, don't do it. It's up to you. If you feel like it's going to draw you closer to God, he says, great, use that. Benefit from that. If you don't want to do that, it's not going to put you any further away from God or draw you any closer to God, simply by observing a certain day or eating or not eating something. Talking a little bit about the dietary laws, perhaps. It's not sinful to do it, but it's not required, is the point he's making. If you remember, binding traditions is what got the Pharisees in trouble with Jesus when they were adding all of these traditions and said, no, no, you have to do this in this certain way that we do it, the way that we like to do it, because that's what you have to do to be a good Jew. And Jesus says, no, you don't. He says, no, that's just stuff that you've added because you like it and you want to control people. He said, God has not required that of you. So the question is for the Sabbath. What do we do with it? Should we practice a Sabbath rest? It could be a very beneficial practice. There's a lot of merit to that. It could be helpful. It could serve to draw you closer to God. But should we bind it as a command with very specific and detailed parameters and requirements? I think the answer is no. Scriptures tell us that it's something that we're not required to do anymore. It could be a useful practice for us, but it's not something that God requires. Part of the liberty that we have in Christ, the freedom from the bondage of the Old Testament, great freedom to worship God in a much freer way. It doesn't lessen our devotion in any way. But the Sabbath, do it, not do it. How should we do it? Should we do it at all? It's a question maybe for some deeper study. I encourage you to engage in that. I hope this has been a blessing to you today, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for watching.